I don't know about you. I've had the experience a fair bit when I'm walking along in the shopping centre or something like that, where you see someone who you know, but you don't recognise them because they're in the wrong context. You never see that person in that spot, and so you just don't recognise them. It takes a little bit to figure out who they are. You should know who they are, but it just takes that little bit of time. Or for me, what normally happens is I don't even see the person. I'll be walking along and Rachel asked me why I ignored the person who smiled and waved at me, and I just wasn't looking for them. I have my mind set on whatever it is, and because I'm focusing on something, I pretty much just block out anyone who's around me for a bit because I'm focusing on what I'm going to buy or something like that. I just don't even see someone. I don't see them, I don't recognise them. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had that experience. If I am, then I guess the illustration is going to fall down for this. But if you have had that experience, then you'll understand how potentially we might not see someone for who they are because of context, and we might not see someone for who they are because of kind of all these other things that are going on in our brain. We've filled it with so much other stuff that we don't actually see somebody at all. In our passage today, we're asked some serious questions. Mark 6 asks us to really, think about how we see Jesus. Do we see Jesus how we should? Do we recognise him for who he really is? Are we recognising Jesus for what he's doing and who he is in the grand scheme of things? Or are we kind of locked into our context? Are we locked into kind of these preconceived ideas about what Jesus is or who Jesus is that we're not seeing him properly? If Mark 4, the end of Mark 4 and Mark 5 is Jesus showing that he's God in those three different ways, then Mark 6 is asking the question of whether we see Jesus as God. It starts with Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. In fact, in his hometown, what people say is, "Isn't this the carpenter?" We know Mary, we know his brothers, we know his sisters. This bloke's just a carpenter. Where did he get all this wisdom from? Where did he get these powers from? They don't see Jesus for who he is. And it's verse 3, by the way, where they go, "Isn't this the carpenter?" So that's at the very, very start of chapter 6. And then just near the end, not right at the end, just near the end, there's the disciples in a boat. And Jesus walks on water. And what Mark says about them right at the end, in verse 51 and 52, is they were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So Mark 4, end of Mark 4 and Mark 5, Jesus shows his power that could only be from God, power that could only really be God. So Jesus shows that he's God. And then Mark 6, we have these people not seeing Jesus for who he is, people not realising who Jesus is. And the passage that we're going to be looking at just a little bit is Herod and a bunch of other people. So I'm going to read from Mark chapter 6, verses 14, and I'll just go to 16. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying, "John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Others said, "He is Elijah," and still others claimed, "He is a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago." But when Herod heard this, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead." So this is Herod and a bunch of other people trying to figure out who Jesus is. Who could this Jesus bloke be? He's doing all these amazing things. He's healing people. He's feeding thousands. These amazing things. Who could this Jesus be? And they minimise who Jesus is. Oh, it's John the Baptist. That's how he can do these miraculous things. Or maybe it's Elijah, or it's a prophet of long ago. Not God, something a little bit lower. And the interesting thing is as they minimise it, that it means they don't need to listen to Jesus' message. They try to get out of who Jesus says he is. I mean, I find it astounding that people still don't listen to Jesus, even if they do minimise it. So Herod, who thinks John might be raised from the dead, doesn't think, well, maybe I should listen to this Jesus bloke, because if John has been raised from the dead, that's some pretty amazing things. They don't think about that. If it's Elijah coming back, well, that's a huge thing. Surely listen. But they don't. Their hearts are hard. And even if it is a prophet like a prophet of old, like long ago, why not listen? But people don't. So not only do they minimise who Jesus is, rather than seeing Jesus as God, they try to just make him just like anyone else, but still something amazing happening, raised from the dead or whatever. Rather than seeing Jesus for who he is, they try to kind of get out of seeing him as God. And even if they do honestly believe that he is the minimized version of who he is, they still don't listen. Surely, if they understood who Jesus was, they would have listened. But they didn't. They tried to get out of it. They tried to explain away who he was. Mark is asking us some questions. Because God is at work in all of those things. If it is John raised from the dead, well, God's done that. If it is Elijah coming back, well, God's done that. If it's a prophet like long ago, one of God's messengers, then listen. And if you're listening and if he's honest, then what he's saying about himself means he's not any of those three, but he's actually God. So people are resistant to that and not listening. And so Mark asks the question, Jesus has shown himself to be God. Are we listening? Are we just like Herod and all the others who are trying to figure out who he is and making him less than what he is? They're not the ones we want to be kind of aligning ourselves with. He's not just an ordinary man doing some amazing things. That puts us in the camp of Herod the Great, not followers of Jesus. We don't want to be in the camp of Herod the Great. Mark is asking us, are we going to be disciples? Are we going to follow Jesus? Are we going to listen to what he says? Are we going to see Jesus as God? Are we going to read through what Jesus is doing, what Jesus is saying? And are we going to see Jesus for who he actually is? It's a question that we've got to ask ourselves. It's not a flippant thing that we should just move on past. It's what camp do we sit in? Are we a follower of Herod the Great and the others who try to go, oh, well, it's John the Baptist or Elijah or the prophets? Are we in that camp, which isn't a great camp to be in? Or are we a disciple? Are we a follower of Jesus? And do we actually recognize Jesus, unlike the disciples when he walks on the water, but are we going to recognize Jesus for who he is? Fully man and fully God.